Hello and welcome to this masterclass presented by Just Like Us for School Diversity Week 2021. School Diversity Week is an event created by Just Like Us to celebrate LGBT+ diversity and representation within schools in the UK. In a few moments, I'll be introducing our guest speaker for today, Rabbi Anna Posner, who will be speaking on what Judaism says about sexual orientation and gender identity. She'll also take part in a Q&A towards the end when she'll be answering some of your questions. But before we get started, I'm going to take a moment to talk about safeguarding. Staying safe online is important at all times, and School Diversity Week is no exception, so we've provided a link below to some information that will help you do just that, so please make sure you take a look. Now, I'm so excited to introduce our masterclass speaker for today. Ordained in 2020, she is the rabbi for the Liberal London congregation of Beit Klal Yisrael, as well as the Norwich Liberal Jewish Community. She serves as the Progressive Judaism student chaplain, where she supports Jewish students and helps build the presence of progressive Jewish life in campuses all over the country. Without further ado, I will hand over to Rabbi Anna Posner.
Thank you so much, Alexa. It's really nice to be here, and I'm excited to talk to you all about what Judaism says about gender and sexuality. And I've got a slideshow that will appear on the screen in just one moment, and I will talk you through those slides. So here we go. What does Judaism say about sexual orientation and gender identity? Well, first, I want to tackle this, what does Judaism say? So on the next slide, you'll see, and if we just go to the next slide, thank you so much, that there are, in the UK, there are 5 main different denominations of Judaism. There's a joke that if you have 2 Jews, you get 4 opinions, and that's true within each of the denominations, let alone between the denominations. So it's quite a broad statement to say, what does Judaism say? And I'll tell you a little bit of difference between the denominations. We won't go too far into it because that's not what this session is about. But the main difference between the Orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox denominations and the what's called progressive denominations, which is liberal and reform, and often also Masorti is counted in that progressive umbrella, is the relationship between what is thought to be the divinity of the Torah, the holy text, and therefore the binding nature of Jewish law. So what does that mean? Liberal and Reformed Jews believe that the Torah was not written directly from God to Moses, but rather was inspired by God. So the text itself is not literally God's words, but human, probably men's words. And what does that mean? That means that there's probably more flexibility in what can be done with those words. Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews believe that the Torah was divinely written. Those words in the text are what God said, Moses wrote them down, and from that Jewish law follows. And Masorti Judaism, there are varying opinions, and I'm not a Masorti Jew, so I don't want to go too deeply into that. So what does that mean? That means that the different denominations will have different ways that they can interact with the text, and that includes different ways that communities can interact and relate to issues on gender, sexuality, and a whole host of other things as well. If we go to the next slide, I am, as I said, a liberal Jew. I was trained in a rabbinical school that trains both liberal and reformed Jews, and so largely when I'm speaking, I'll be talking from that perspective. That's my experience. I don't want to misrepresent anybody, so I just wanted to make that clear at the beginning. One of the communities I work for is Beit Klal Yisrael. They were a community that was set up 31 years ago by a group of secular feminist lesbians, and they set up this community to be a space for people who did not feel welcome in mainstream Jewish community. Back then, 31 years ago, it did not feel comfortable and probably did not feel safe to be openly LGBTQ+ in the mainstream Jewish community. And so these women felt that there needed to be a space for them and others who were like them. It wasn't just about being LGBTQ+, it was also about challenging traditional concepts of God and theology, being a place for activists, being a place where you can struggle with ideas of religion and religious identity. And still today, 31 years later, when the wider community has taken huge leaps, and we'll talk more about that later, BKY still is set up to be a place that is welcoming for all of Israel. Israel we use not as the country or the state, but to mean the people of Israel, the Jewish people. And so you see this is from the first page of their website, this slide here, and there's a list, a non-exhaustive list of people who BKY want to make sure and know that they are included in the community. And that includes Jews committed to working out the implications of gender equality regardless of sex, sexual orientation and gender identity, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, queer or otherwise identifying Jews, Jews who want to work out a creative and evolving relationship as feminists to Judaism and being Jewish, and the list goes on. And of course, it could continue to go on for pages and pages. So if we go to the next slide. In Judaism, we work a lot with text. It is often referred to as the religion of the book. So I'm here to talk about what does Judaism say about sexuality and gender. So we'll go to the text. We'll start with sexuality. And often, when you look on face value, what does Judaism say about sexuality? We're brought to these texts from Leviticus that have been used across centuries to cause great harm. And these are the prohibition texts around homosexual sex, really. It's not talking about relationship here, it's talking about sexual intercourse. So we have, thou shalt not lie with a man after the manner of a woman, it is an abomination. That's Leviticus 18:22. And then we have, and if a man lie with mankind as with womankind, both of them have committed abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. Leviticus 20:13. And these texts should come with a trigger warning. They're painful to read. The implications of them are hurtful, and the impact that they've had on law and religious community for hundreds of years has caused such damage that it cannot be explained. But this is on face value what the law is, what the Jewish law is. Now, to put these texts in context, they come surrounded by other laws around sexual intercourse, and the core of the messaging of those laws is reproduction possible? So it looks at also bestiality, and this is not me comparing, and in some ways it's not even the text comparing. What the text is trying to do is look at one of the most important laws is be fruitful and multiply, and is it possible in these relationships to be fruitful and multiply? There's also some stuff in there I don't want to ignore around ownership and people's property, and in the ancient structures of marriage, marriage was acquisition, and so the women in these partnerships were seen to have been acquired, and therefore adultery was seen as effectively stealing someone else's property. And so it's a horrible way to put it. It's not how I think anybody looks at marriage nowadays, but just to put that in the context as well, it's not just about reproduction, but that other stuff as well. So that's these texts in context. However, are these texts alone enough to say, therefore Judaism does not allow same-sex relationships? I want to take here a message from the Orthodox chief rabbi, which is in a current guide that was put out for Orthodox schools around LGBT inclusion, and particularly principles of bullying, of policies of bullying to avoid LGBTQ+ bullying in their communities. And the chief rabbi said, "We are of course aware of the Torah's prohibitions here, including Leviticus 18:22. But when homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying is carried out with justifications from Jewish texts, a major desecration of God's name is caused. We must be ever mindful to the mitzvah, to the commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself, considered by Rabbi Akiva, who's one of the great sages of Jewish tradition, to be the most important principle of Torah. So what's the chief Orthodox rabbi saying here? He's saying that to use these texts to harm people would go against other Jewish values and therefore would be a desecration of God's name. He then goes on to say, bear in mind this important guide is aimed at school leadership and those charged with ensuring a responsible school environment that meets the needs of pupils. It talks about current regulatory requirements, but also says they must be predicated on Jewish law, Jewish values, ethos, and outlook. So I want to talk a little bit about, so Jewish law is important, and that is why the Orthodox chief rabbi couldn't say, from the way that he looks at the text in Jewish law, as we spoke about before, that relationship there, he couldn't ignore the fact that they were aware of the prohibitions. And so whilst it still might be quite hurtful for some to have that text there to say these are prohibitions, I can't stress enough the message and the great value of the Orthodox chief rabbi putting his name to such a document. It gives it the gravitas that it deserves, and this document will make many kids safer in schools because the Orthodox chief rabbi has said, your main priority is not to worry about this prohibition here, but to worry about how safe, loved, and included your young people are. So while the whole document in and of itself might not please everybody, shall we say, it is a huge leap forward and will do such good for those people whose schools take it on. And I want to talk a little bit about what some of these values and ethos and outlook that the chief rabbi, the Orthodox chief rabbi, is talking about. There's an idea, it's called pikuach nefesh in Hebrew, and it means the sanctity of life. It is the most important value in Judaism, is about the sanctity of life and ensuring safety and well-being for every individual life. And as we know from the statistics, LGBTQ plus individuals and youth are more likely than others to suffer from mental health, to die from suicide, to be victims of bullying and abuse. And there is a recognition in the need for such policies to protect those young people, which can come under the principle of pikuach nefesh. We've also seen here, treat others as you wish to be treated. And then there's this idea in creation of B'Tselem Elohim, the image of God. Humans are created in God's image, which doesn't mean that God looks like each one of us. However, it means that each person is created with a holiness within them. And if human beings are created in God's image, then there can be no mistakes in creation. And what's more, it makes all of humanity, because of course in creation we didn't have division of nations or religions or race or sexuality or whatever it might be. All people are holy and all people are equal. If we move on to the next slide, that's a little bit about Torah and some text and those painful texts. But what's happening in Jewish community today? Well, I want to say that open, welcome, and inclusive communities in liberal reform communities that for years they have been really struggling and trying to make sure that their communities are not just inclusive but known to be inclusive. What's the messaging on the website? What does it look like when people come into this space? Are there how are the texts used? What's people's language? Open, welcoming, and inclusive communities. I've written an organisation on here called Keshet UK. They have been doing a lot of this work with communities, and not just progressive communities who are able to be flexible with Jewish law and Jewish texts, but with the whole span of the Jewish community. It's because of Keshet UK that the Orthodox Jewish rabbi, Keshet UK worked with the Orthodox Jewish rabbi on this document for schools. And Keshet UK work on the principle of meeting the communities where they're at and seeing where they can take them. So for an ultra-Orthodox community, what inclusion looks like for them might be very different from what a liberal community, what inclusion looks like for them. But Keshet will work with all communities across the spectrum to move people forward in conversations and actions on inclusion. We spoke about the Guide for Orthodox Schools, youth movements. There are loads of Jewish youth movements who are often, again, across the religious spectrum, at the forefront of talking about all inclusion and LGBTQ plus inclusion particularly. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we start talking about gender, because I could go on for hours about all of this stuff. There's the Rainbow Jews project, which is something you might want to look up. That is a project that takes it's a project that takes the stories of LGBTQ plus Jews throughout UK British history, and that from 1950s to, it was published in 2012, and you can hear, if you look at Rainbow Jews Project online, you can hear stories of how these individuals changed the landscape and what their experiences were as well. Equal marriage. I'm very proud to say that liberal Judaism, along with the Quakers and joined by Reform Judaism and others, were at the forefront of the conversations around equal marriage in 2014, or which was made legal in 2014. 15, I think it was. And in the head of liberal Judaism at the time, I suppose chief rabbi of liberal Judaism at the time, gave evidence in Parliament about the importance of equal marriage and same-sex marriage, which is more accurate probably to say than equal marriage, as we know that it's not completely equal. And it is largely because of the Quakers and of liberal Jews, Reform Jews, and everyone else who was involved in that, that same-sex marriages are now allowed in most religious institutions. I should say it's legal. Whether or not that individual religious institution will do it is another conversation, as it's left to individual decision. Whilst equal marriage was made law, I think in 2015, same-sex ceremonies and civil partnerships were allowed since 2005. And again, liberal Judaism were at the forefront of holding ceremonies for same-sex couples. And I think the first Jewish lesbian wedding I went to was in 2005 at a synagogue on the bima, which is the prayer stage. And with that comes inclusive ketubot. Ketubot are marriage certificates, and you can get marriage certificates that aren't just about a man and a woman. You can get marriage certificates that are for all genders and for same-sex couples as well. There's a Pride Shabbat every year. I've been involved in it the past few years. It's fabulous. It rotates which synagogue hosts it, and I think we had, when we were last in person, we had about 150 people in the community, and online the possibilities are endless because people come from far and wide. So that's a little scrape about what's happening in the community and what it's like for LGBTQ Jews in the community today. Let's move forward. Let's talk a bit about gender. So if we go to the next slide. Gender in Judaism. So I actually want to correct this a little bit, because what we're really talking about is sex in Judaism. Sex is assigned to a person on the basis of primary sex characteristics, genitalia, and other factors and reproductive functions. And gender is often expressed in terms of masculinity and femininity, and gender is largely culturally determined and it's assumed from the sex assigned at birth. These are definitions from Stonewall, and it's an important distinction, and you'll see why when we start talking about what is said about gender, or rather sex, in Judaism. So if we go to the next slide, there's a lot of information I'm throwing at you here. So again, we're going back to some text. So I mentioned the Torah, and the last text we looked at were from the Torah. In Judaism, there's a full literary canon. There's the Torah, there's something called the Talmud, which is made up of two other sections called the Mishnah and the Gemara. Don't worry, you don't need to remember all of that. But what that Mishnah and Gemara is basically commentary and argument over the course of 2,000 years, commentary, argument, stories, rabbis arguing with each other for 2,000 years about what does the Torah mean, to put it simply. And from those arguments and stories and conversations comes Jewish law. So there's something called midrash, and midrash is when the story in Torah doesn't give you all the information. Sometimes the rabbis try to understand what that story is saying and fill in the gaps. Sometimes they'll write their own stories, and sometimes they'll have conversations like this one. So that's just to give you a bit of context. So it says, God says, let us make Adam in our image, in our shape. Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar said, when the Eternal created Adam, initially he was created as both genders. Thus it is written, male and female did God create them. So these quotes are taken straight from Torah, and the rabbis are debating what do these quotes mean. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman said, when the Eternal created Adam initially, God created him with two faces, one on each side. And when God made Eve, God split him along the middle, forming two backs. They challenged him, but it's written, and God took one of his ribs, this idea that woman was made from one of Adam's ribs. He said, that word that you think means rib doesn't mean rib. It means one of his sides, because that word that you say means rib, when you look later in another text, it's the same word that's used to mean the side of the tent. So it doesn't mean rib, but it means side. So the side of Adam was separated. What this text is saying is that man and woman was not created, here's man and here's woman, but indeed we were created as one human being and split. The picture on the side here is from an album from a group called Girls in Trouble, and it's the picture. She makes music, this woman in this group make music around the stories, around these midrash. And this song, this picture is from a song called We Are Androgynous, Double-Faced Beings. Those are the lyrics, and that's the picture from that. So this is her image of creation, of that double-faced being. So there's something quite powerful in that, particularly when people often use the creation story to say, well, look, this is how God created us. But it's not 100% clear that two genders or two sexes is actually how God created us. Let's go to the next slide. So that's not all Judaism has to say about sex or about gender. In this vast canon of Jewish literature that I told you about, there are actually 7 different genders. These are those 7 different genders. You've got zachar, male, nekeva, female. You've also got androgynous, which is someone who has both male and female characteristics. I want to make really clear, these are the Hebrew words, and the definition of those Hebrew words is next to it. There's something called a tumtum, a person whose sexual characteristics are unclear. An ailonit, a female who does not develop in puberty and is infertile. A saris hama, a male who does not develop at puberty and is infertile, and a saris adam, a male who is castrated or made infertile through human intervention. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll have a look a little bit about how these genders come out in text. So I've just picked 2 texts because we're limited in time and we could go on forever. But here are 2 texts from the Mishnah. So a tumtum and an androgynous are obligated in all of these commandments because of a doubt. So what does that mean? Well, in Judaism, and again, we're talking in ancient Jewish law, and this comes out differently through the different denominations of Judaism, there are some commandments that are obligated for men to do, some that are obligated for women to do, and some that are obligated for both to do. And so when we're talking about different genders or different sexes, what the rabbis and commentators want to understand is, well, okay, what of the commandments do these people do? So whilst it's not a radical expression of the rabbis realizing people can have whatever gender identity they might want. What these texts do show us is that there was an understanding that at least sex is on a spectrum, biological sex is on a spectrum, and there's no kind of like, and so we cast this person out or whatever it might be, but there was an understanding which is typical of rabbis trying to understand Jewish law of, well, what do we do with these individuals and which box do they fit in so that we know which laws that they should follow, if that makes sense. So you see it again in this next text. It says, in what ways is he like both men and women? One who strikes him or curses him is liable, as in the case of men and women. One who unwittingly kills him must go into exile, and if on purpose, then the slayer receives the death penalty, as in the case of both men and women. His mother must bring an offering, as in the case of men and women. He may eat holy things that are eaten outside the temple, and he may inherit any inheritance, as is the case of men and women. So this comes in a whole batch of texts. The first bit's like, how is this person like a man? How is this person like a woman? And again, what it's talking about is, how should they interact in society? What box can we put them in, because we're trying to understand people in boxes. And then again, there's other texts which I didn't bring that also talk about again, this idea of being fruitful and multiplying, and how does that interact with, particularly if we're talking about these categories of biological sexes who are infertile, and how do they interact? So it's things like who they're allowed to marry, but there is no obligation to marry if they're infertile, but they can if they want to, and that kind of thing. So that is the 7 sexes of Judaism. We'll go back one slide, I think, just so you can see them again. The 7 sexes, you might see if you Google this, sometimes it says 6, sometimes it says 8. It's that idea again of 2 Jews, 4 opinions, and a lot of this is about interpretation of text. And the Talmud, that document itself, is something like 27 volumes of arguments and interpretation of text. But 7 is the ones that I have here. So let's move on 2 slides. And we'll look again about, this time, gender in Jewish community today. So again, Jewish communities are striving and often succeeding in being open, welcome, and inclusive. I think that it's fair to say that conversations about gender and gender inclusivity are somewhat behind in the general society than conversations around sexuality. And I think that in Jewish community, that's true too. That's not to say that those conversations are not in full throw now and happening now, but certainly that's happened more so over the last few years, just as we've seen in general society. Again, Keshet UK are doing a lot of that work in community, and once again meeting people where they're at and moving people forward from the position they're at. Twilight People is a project by the same people who did Rainbow Jews. This is a general faith project about gender and faith, and again interviewing individuals of trans and varying genders about their gender identity and their faith identity. Once again, we've got the youth movements who are at the forefront of all of this. Hebrew is a very gendered language. Everything is gendered. The way that you speak to a man is different to the way you speak to a woman, and that makes it very difficult when using Hebrew language to have a spectrum of gender. And the youth movements have done an amazing job of ungendering, I suppose, of some of the language that would be very gendered. So they use Hebrew words for participants, for leaders, and for various other things, and they've played with the Hebrew grammar in order to make it, I guess, ungendered. They also, in one of the youth movements that I spend a lot of time with in LJY Netza, which is the youth movement of the liberal movement, they have badges when you go on camp. You can choose if you want to have your pronoun badge. And so you get your, the leaders get their lanyards, and they often have their pronoun badges on it, and the kids can choose to have those as well. And there are sessions educating on gender and sexuality and celebrating the whole community. There's representation. I know that the Orthodox youth movement have made sure to have representation in their leadership and in the sessions that they run. And I'm sure I'm not even covering the half of what the amazing things that the youth movements do. And often the youth movements are at the real forefront of this, and the adult movements catch up. And you see that happening in so many different things. Again, we've got Pride Shabbat and the inclusive ketubot. I have thrown so much at you, and I've only scratched the surface. I hope that some of it was interesting and you managed to soak some of it in. I would love to take any of your questions now, and hopefully we can continue these conversations.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing. I've learned so much. I'm sure everybody else has who is listening, and that's perfect timing because now we do have some questions for you. We will now take some questions from our audience, and all of the questions today have been submitted by school students, but they're being asked you by some of our Just Like Us ambassadors. And the first one that we're going to ask you is from Lily.
Hello there. I have 2 questions here. So are there many spaces for LGBT plus Jewish people currently, and what support is out there for LGBT plus Jews?
Thank you. Amazing question. There are a lot of spaces for LGBTQ plus Jews. Like I said, the mainstream communities are wide open and welcoming, and you can contact your local community and you can be whoever you want to be within those communities. In terms of LGBTQ plus specific spaces, there's the Jewish LGBTQ plus group, there's my community BKY, which is actually a community, as I said, for everybody, so it's not a specifically LGBTQ plus space, but certainly it's got that rooted in its history. There's Gay Jews in London, and there's a group called Laviot, which is for all female identifying individuals. There's the JW3, which is a social Jewish centre in the centre of London, but they have loads of stuff online, and they do a queer cafe. There is a group called Imaot ve'Abaot, which means mothers and fathers, which is a social group for families who have one or more parent who identify as Jewish and LGBTQ plus. There's Rainbow Jews that I spoke about. There's Twilight People. There's a whole host of other things that I'm sure anyone who's watching this is saying, what about this? What about this? But there's certainly loads of spaces for LGBTQ plus Jews.
Thank you.
That sounds so amazingly welcoming. That's so good to know. Right, so our next one to move swiftly on is from Lorcan.
Hi. So what steps do you think could be taken in synagogues to make them more welcoming for LGBTQ plus Jewish people?
Another great question. I think that when we talk about inclusion, and I don't really like the word inclusion, but it's the word we have at the moment. I think it's all well and good for people to sit around and say, oh, look at how inclusive we are. But it doesn't actually do anything unless you are projecting that for the outside world to see. And I think that communities across the board could do a much better job of showing how open and welcoming they are, with representation, with messaging on the website, just with making it loud and clear that, you know, you're welcome here, anyone's welcome here, and this is a community for you. I think there is sometimes a feeling that communities focus on families, and in that often kind of heteronormative families. And it's about making sure that that messaging is out there and different. Like I said, that everyone's welcome. It's not just about families, that you can be an individual. It's not just about heteronormative families. It's about everybody.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
That's a brilliant question. I was wondering about that as well. These are all so good. I hope you're enjoying them. So the next one is from Charlie. Do we have?
Hello. Sorry, my camera's not behaving. What was it like coming out as a lesbian and a rabbi?
So I'm actually very lucky. The family I grew up in you know, that lesbian wedding I spoke about that I went to in 2005 was my parents' friends and my community. So I always grew up knowing, certainly within my community, that I was welcome. There's a backdrop of this, of Section 28, and there being no representation in my school, or kind of conversations around sexuality weren't allowed. It was illegal for people to be seen to be advertising LGBTQ lifestyles, but that's a backdrop. Certainly in my family and in my Jewish community, I felt very welcome, and knew it was possible to be both Jewish and gay. That's not true of everybody's story. I want to say that because there are some people again who might be like, oh gosh, well, you know, whatever. I had a different story to that. It's funny. I love that the question is, what was it like to come out as a lesbian and a rabbi? Because I actually think my parents were more shocked when I said I wanted to be a rabbi than they were when I said that I was a lesbian. There are loads of LGBTQ rabbis. I should say there are loads of LGB rabbis. There are also LGBTQ rabbis, but I don't know if I can say there are loads of them. And they're often called the rainbow rabbis. And certainly when I was training at my college, Leo Baeck College, I think there was one stage where it was about 50-50 LGBTQ in the student body. So there's certainly a lot of representation in progressive Judaism of LGBTQ plus rabbis. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Just the words rainbow and rabbi together make me feel so happy. That's so wonderful.
That's great.
Right, so now we have a question from Ash for you.
Hello, Anna. Thank you so much for all the information today. So my question is, if people who aren't Jewish want to find out more about Judaism and topics relating to LGBT plus and Judaism, where can they go to find these sort of things out?
That's a great question. So I've spoken about Rainbow Jews and Twilight People. There's also Keshet UK that I spoke a lot about. If you want to know about Judaism in general, I'd say look at the websites and social media platforms of all the different denominations of Judaism. You'll get an idea of the spectrum. Liberal Judaism, which is where I work, so I've been speaking about it a lot, have recently done a biennial conference. All the videos are online. The theme was breaking down walls, and it was looking at issues of inclusion. If you fancy checking out any of those videos, it might be interesting to see a liberal Jewish perspective on, I guess, trying to do better at inclusion. There's also some on social media. You've got accounts Hey Alma and Modern Jewish Ritual. Modern Ritual. Those are both American accounts, but they've got lots of content on there. There's a website, My Jewish Learning, which is again general Jewish learning. And on Instagram, there's an individual called Adam Eli, who does lots of activism in the LGBTQ plus world and is also Jewish. And there's this idea that there's a saying in Hebrew which means every Jew is responsible one for the other. And Adam Eli's message is, well, this should be true of every human, but in minority communities, he puts it forward as every queer person should be responsible one for the other. So he does activism all over the world with that in mind, that we are each responsible one for the other. And so his social media is popping with all sorts of information. Again, there's loads of other stuff, but that's probably enough to go with for now.
Okay, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Brilliant. I hope you're ready for your final question, and Rory is going to be asking that.
Yeah.
Hi, Rabbi Anna. I want to say first, I actually had the privilege of marching alongside Keshet at Pride in London in 2019 because I have a friend involved with them, and it was an incredible experience walking alongside, what you call rainbow rabbis. Very, very moving. So I love the work they do. So my question for you is that, a lot of us, we hear about bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs. Can you tell us a bit more about the gender neutral bene mitzvahs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I also love that you were with Keshet marching at Pride. It's more relevant to Monday's panel, but what I love about Pride is there's the faith block. So it's often kind of the Jews marching in the middle with Christians behind and the Muslims in front, and it's just amazing to have that kind of interfaith march. And I'm sure there's all the other faiths are represented there as well, but I see who's in front and behind. In answer to your question, so like I said, Hebrew is a very gendered language. The coming of age ceremony when you're 13, sometimes when you're 12, again, it depends on the denomination of Judaism. Boys will always have it when they're 30, have their bar or bat mitzvah or bene mitzvah when they're 13. Girls sometimes in some denominations have it when they're 12. And the gendered nature of Hebrew means that it's either a bar for a boy or bat for a girl. Bene mitzvah is actually, if we're talking literally about Hebrew grammar, bene is the plural. But just as when we use they in English, and sometimes it can be the plural and sometimes it can be the singular, bene mitzvah is an opportunity to use non-gendered or less gendered language for those who do not identify as wanting to have a bar or a bat mitzvah. Other elements of a bar or bat mitzvah don't have to be so gendered. It's literally just in the language, which is incredibly important, but it's quite an easy fix. You say it's a bene mitzvah instead of a bar or bat mitzvah. And then when calling people up to Torah, that again can be a gendered act because of the gendered nature of Hebrew and the language that's used. So there are some rabbis where just for bene mitzvah, they change the language to, you can say instead of you come up, which would be either male or female, you can say please come up, which puts it in the infinitive. And that is, the infinitive doesn't have a gender. I like to use that anytime I'm calling people up for Torah, just to, you know, there's no reason why we need to use gendered language at any time, and certainly not for those instances. And so instead of saying ta'amod or ya'amod, I would say na la'amod, which is instead of saying you, I'd say please come up. That is, in a nutshell, the differences between the gender neutral bene mitzvah. I hope that answers your question. I wasn't sure if you're expecting that it would be a whole different ceremony.
Oh no, I studied Judaism as part of my degree, but I've actually learned so much today that I didn't even know. Thank you.
I think we've all learned so much today, and it's been so enjoyable. That's all the questions we have for you today. So first of all, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. It was so wonderful to listen to. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. And thank you to everybody who's asked those amazing questions. Just adds to the experience of this learning that we're doing. This masterclass is actually coming to an end now, but please do have a look at some of the other amazing masterclasses happening this Diversity Week. And you can do that by heading to www.justlikeus.org/masterclasses. And if you also head to that website, you can find some more online safety resources on the Just Like Us website. So thank you so much again for joining us, and we hope that you have a fantastic School Diversity Week.